Hi, I'm Lizelle Sambry, and welcome back to my channel where I talk about all things writing, traditional publishing, and a little bit of reading. And today I am sharing my entire creative process from idea to finished novel. And this is pre-publication. So this is assuming that I do not have any sort of publishing contract in place. I am starting fully from scratch, creating a book, going from that idea all the way to the finished novel. And so I wanted to outline this because I have gotten some questions before from people about what is my whole process? And I feel like my process is divided into many different sections of different videos. And so I wanted to create this video to be a full overview, and in this video, if there are other videos in which I have broken down a process very comprehensively, I'm going to just reference that video and talk about what you can find there and direct you to that video. And so that way, this is kind of a little bit of a hub for those who really want to know about what is my entire writing process. I can share this and it's all one video, and then I can also still send you off to other videos where you can get more details. And so that's what this is going to be. There are timestamps below, of course, and let's go ahead and get started. My stories begin with what I call the work of not working. So this is essentially mental pre-work. So for me, a story does not start when I sit down at the computer and type out something. For me, my stories start in my head with that mental pre-work. I often will think a lot about a story just in my mind before I actually decide, yeah, okay, this is something that I want to write. And so for me, this can be a lot of different things. So for example, for A Mastery of Monsters, which is my YA dark academia that comes out summer 2025, I spent a lot of time thinking about the characters, visualizing different sort of cool scenes that I could put together. And why I do this is because I'm aware that in order for me to pull a book together, I need to feel like there is enough for a book. And sometimes I will have a passing thought, a passing idea, and it's just not enough to craft a book from. And so doing that mental pre-work, thinking about those ideas, thinking about different scenes, helps me in thinking that an idea can be a book, that it can be more than just those flitting thoughts in my head. I can have a scene, I can think of conflict, and I can put that together and have a more concrete idea of what I actually want to create. And then also that I can get excited about it, that I can build enthusiasm. When I am sitting around thinking of all the different scenes and the different characters and all of that sort of thing, that gets me excited about an idea. It makes me feel passionate about an idea. And when I have that sort of passion, then I want to write it. And so it's good for me to have that mental pre-work phase. And this can be all sorts of time periods. This could be days of me thinking about it. This could be months. This could be on and off for years. It really just depends. The next step is what I call choosing the right idea. And I say this because what feels like the right idea at the time may change over time, but at the point that I choose it, it feels like the right idea. And so how this comes from that mental pre-work is after doing all of that mental work for a while, I eventually will put the idea in my Notion. So I have a video, which I will link down below. I'll link all the videos that I mentioned down below, but I have a video where I talk about how I track my writing ideas in Notion. So if you want to know specifically how I put ideas in Notion and how I organize them, all of that, including a template, I would check out that video. But so I put my idea in Notion there. I will put an age category on it. I write sort of everything that I have about the idea, and I add to these things over time. So sometimes I will just put the idea and that's it. Sometimes I have some scenes. And the more mental pre-work that I did on this book, the more I will have to actually put in that whole Notion little idea thing. And from there, I kind of attach it to a priority, that sort of thing. I recently had an idea for a adult thriller that's near future, speculative, about kind of a workplace person who becomes obsessed with another coworker. And I really liked that idea. And so I set it as a high priority because I really liked the idea. and I put some stuff in there. Over time, I added different scenes and that sort of thing. And so it's not necessarily like a one-step process, mental pre-work, put in Notion, and then pick idea. Sometimes it's mental pre-work, put in Notion, more mental pre-work, more put in Notion, more mental pre-work, more put in Notion. Like sometimes it just like goes like that. And so when it comes time where I'm like, okay, now I would like to get working on a new book, then I look through those ideas. It's organized based on like that priority tag I've put on them. And so I look through the high priority things. And sometimes I just have something that's already been circling in my brain for a while, and I just already know that I want to do that. And so that's kind of how that comes together. Things that I consider when I am choosing that idea, when I'm really like picking things out. The first is the age category. Because I have contracted projects going on all the time, really, there are sometimes restrictions on which age category I can write in next at what time. And so then I have to kind of really feel that out and know what I have the room contractually to do next. I also think about if an idea feels fresh. So I have a lot of ideas and I may be really excited about an idea, but does it feel kind of fresh or unique enough for the market? And so I think about that. I also think about genre, because sometimes maybe I've kind of written in a genre recently. Do I want to stick with that, or do I want to hop to something different? So that's something else that I consider. And then most importantly for me is passion. That's what matters the most to me, is me being passionate about the project. So for an example, I will mention A Mastery of Monsters again. At the time that I decided to work on that project, I did feel that dark academia might be a little bit saturated, but I really, really, really wanted to write it, so I did it anyway. And so even though I think about these things, I think about age category, freshness, those sorts of things, because I am an author as a career. Like, this is, you know, it's my passion and my art, but it is also my business. And so I do want to consider those sorts of things. But again, at the end of the day, the artistic spirit takes over. And if I want to work on something, even if I don't think the genre is like the most sellable or it feels oversaturated, I'm still going to do it if I really want to, especially if I feel that the take that I am putting on it, the spin that I am putting on it, feels fresh for it, which I feel like I feel about all of my books. Like, I wouldn't just write something that I felt was already out there. I always want to write something that feels like it's new. And so those are the things that I consider. And so at that point, I've decided, I picked my idea. I'm like, okay, this is what I'm going to work on. And that for me is that process of kind of choosing the idea and the sorts of things that I think about. Again, different factors play into it, but at the end of the day, I'm going to write what I'm most excited to write. And that process of like choosing the right idea usually only takes me a few minutes. Often by the time I jump into that Notion and I'm picking which idea I want to work on next, I already have like a pretty good idea of what project I'm most passionate about. Like, it's rare that I'll go in there and not know already which idea I'm going to just zone in on because I've been pondering those things to begin with. And so usually that process is pretty quick. Next is the plotting process. And so before I even start plotting, my very first step is to check my different calendars to see where I have time to actually be working on this project. And so the first step of that is that I go to my Notion, because in my Notion I have a kind of 2-year overview of where my projects are and where the time gaps are. I do have a video, which again, link down below. I really should stop saying link down below every time, because I'm gonna have a lot of videos to reference here. So I have a video where I show you how I organize my writing time and schedule using Notion. There again is also a template. And so if you want to know very specifically how I organize that 2-year sort of schedule, it's in there. So I will look in there and I will organize working on the project around my contracted work. So I don't always know when my deadlines are going to be for contracted work, but I usually have a pretty good idea. And so I will basically put placeholders in for that. And then I will find places to work on other books around that. And so I like to look at that 2-year schedule first to see, okay, which month am I going to be working on plotting this project in? And I know that plotting tends to take me about a month to do, sometimes longer, but usually the standard for me scheduling it out is a month. And so I will find a spot for that. And I will put it in that 2-year calendar. And then I go over to my Google Calendar. And then I will specifically put in the very specific dates I'm going to work on it. Then I go back to my Notion, because in my Notion I also have like little like pages specifically for projects. And in there I'll put in that I'm going to be working on plotting it. I'll put in the specific dates for plotting. And that's kind of where I put that together. And then I will also set a schedule for plotting. So for example, I would say, okay, I'm going to do these things for plotting on these days, these things for plotting on these days, and I will create a checklist within that Notion card, so that I know every single day that I'm working on this is what I'm working on. So it's kind of like I start with a wide scope, with that 2-year scope. When in 2 years am I working on this time? Then I go to Google, I narrow down what are the specific days, and then I go into Notion and I narrow down even more. What am I doing every single day that I'm working on this? And I will do that as a checklist, and I will check that off as I go. And this is to make sure that I have like a very good, robust schedule to keep me on track for when I'm doing the plotting. So that happens even before the plotting actually starts. So how I plot is I plot out all of my books using a program called Plottr, and using the Save the Cat story structure. And so I have some extremely comprehensive and very detailed videos on this. I have a whole playlist in which I break down how I plot my books using the Save the Cat plotting structure. I talk through examples. I talk about the ways that my process kind of differs from how Save the Cat lays it out. I also have a video where I do a complete beat sheet of Save the Cat using my method and share that completely with you. And using that same example book, I have a whole video called How I Use Plottr to Plot Novels. So the title is something like that. And in there, I share my comprehensive plotting process, exactly how I plot a book from kind of start to finish, the things I think about, the things I do. That entire kind of process is contained within those series of videos. So if you want to see that very detailed process of how I use the Save the Cat story structure and how I plot books in Plottr, please check out those videos. Hello, I am interrupting this video because my camera did a very annoying thing in which it randomly deleted some of the video clips. I have no idea why. I could not explain it to you. But anyway, I'm going to be popping in here and also once more in this video just to re-put in all of the content that it cut out. I'm sorry for this happening, but alas, I am here. Anyway, we will fill in the gaps and everything will be okay. I'm sure I am more frustrated than you are. So yeah, so drafting. So when I start my drafting process, very similar to the plotting process, the first thing that I do is I go to my Notion 2-year calendar and I make sure that I have space for drafting. I try and leave about like kind of like 2 to 3 months of space. This is because usually the word count goal that I'm going for is 100,000 words, and I know that my chapters are going to be about 2,000 words each, or at least that's the goal. And so usually I have about 50 chapters in that case, and so I know that I need 50 days in order to work on this. And because I only work on weekdays and not weekends or holidays, usually by the time that I plug that into a little date calculator that I use, usually it ends up being kind of roughly like 2 to 3 months of drafting that I need. And I work on 1 chapter per day. That's the way I set it out. But because I use Scrivener to kind of track my progress, it likes word counts. And so I put in word counts, but really like I sit down and I do a chapter a day. And so really the like days that I work on it is more likely to be broken out based on chapters than word count. And so that's kind of how I plug things into the Google Calendar. I don't make a daily to-do list either, because I know that I'm just working on one chapter per day. And so there's not really any need for me to do anything like that. Though sometimes I might plug in the word count into Notion so that I can get a percentage, so I can kind of see what percentage complete I am. My drafting process on a daily basis goes basically, I sit down, I try and be at my desk at 9 a.m. That doesn't always happen, but I do try. And so I go there, and what I will do is I will pull up the plotter file in the outline view, which shows me kind of everything I have planned for that chapter that day. And so I sit down and I look through everything I have planned for that chapter. I make sure it makes sense to me. Sometimes I might be making little changes, or I might think, oh, maybe I need to add this scene or that scene, what have you. But really the process is that I look at my plan and I make sure that I understand everything that needs to go into the chapter for my plan. And then sometimes I may need to look up reference photos or something before I start, and I will do that. And then I start writing. And so I write continuously. I don't do sprints or anything like that. I used to do sprints. I just prefer not to do it. I would rather just write continuously until I have the chapter done. Sometimes I will pause when I'm writing the chapter and I will look back at my plotter notes. Sometimes I need reference photos or whatever in the middle of the chapter, and I'll look back and do that. Sometimes I don't remember a character's name, in which case I usually just do square brackets and I'll just write blank and know that I'll fix it when I'm editing. Basically, when I'm drafting, I want to be able to continue a drafting flow. And so I only stop if I feel like what I might need to put in a square bracket would be too big. So for example, if I need to describe something, I would rather look up the reference photo right at that moment, look at different things, and like be able to put the full description in than to do like square brackets, description of a castle. I'd rather not do that. But if it's like a character name that I just can't remember at the moment, I'll just do square brackets and I'll put blank or whatever description of the character, and then I'll go back and I can fix that in editing. When it's something that's like that tedious, I don't really want to interrupt my writing flow to do that, but I will interrupt it for something as big as like descriptions, that sort of thing, or pausing to look at my plotting notes. And then once I've finished the chapter, I will go back to Plotter and I will look through all my notes again to make sure that I got everything in the chapter that I was supposed to get in the chapter. Sometimes I don't get things in just because it didn't work or it didn't feel natural in the chapter, in which case I honestly just leave it. Because when I go and I do my full read through of the book in the editing process, which I'm going to talk about in a second, I can make note of things that I've missed. And so I just kind of like chaotically just like leave it. If I didn't put it in the book and I was supposed to, okay, well, whatever. I'll move on. That'll be part of the editing process. And so that is how I draft. And I literally just continue to do that until the project is finished. Sometimes things might come up and like derail me. And so I didn't get to write that day, or I had to postpone it. And so then I have to change my scheduling. I change the calendar. Sometimes something is just taking me longer than I expected and I have to update and change the calendar, that sort of thing. Sometimes I'm feeling really good and I can do multiple chapters per day, and I do that. Sometimes I'm really tired, or I'm like, for whatever reason, I just like can't bring myself to write that day, and then I don't. Really, I try and be strict with myself and keep up that schedule of writing every weekday, but sometimes there are just things that come up in life and you just don't have time. And for me, when I'm working on my projects, I always try and give myself a lot of time to work on things. And so I usually have more than enough time where if I take off a day here or there, it is really not going to matter in the grand scheme of things. And so that's why I can be that way with myself. So I try and be as regimented as possible, but I just know that if I need a break, I just need a break. And if you don't take a break, your body will take a break for you. And I feel like that's what I really just feel like and believe. Sometimes there are times to push yourself. Like I know personally when I'm just feeling lazy and when I really just cannot do something. The next part of the process, once I'm finished drafting, writing that first draft of the book, is to do a self-edit. I do not let people see my first drafts. I do not want to do that under any circumstances, and so I always avoid it. And this is not just because of like self-consciousness of like a first draft being bad. It's also for me, if I show someone my first draft, I already know there's a bunch of things to fix. And so to me, if I already know there's a bunch of things I need to fix and I give the first draft to someone anyway, chances are they're just going to repeat things that I already know need to be fixed. And so it's kind of a waste of time all around. Whereas I prefer to do a self-edit because when I do a self-edit, I have fixed everything that I think needs to be fixed. And so that way, when I send it out to readers, to my agent, to beta readers, what have you, they are only going to be mentioning things that I didn't realize need to be fixed. And to me, that is much more worthwhile because then we're not just repeating information. Like, it's annoying to me if I do a first draft and I know one character is shallow and then I send it to readers and they're like, this character is shallow. Yeah, I already knew that. So what's the point is kind of my feeling. And that's just for me personally. Some people like other people to look at their first drafts. I just don't find it helpful. And so I like to do a self-edit first. And so that is my next part of the process. If possible, I like to be able to take a week or two off after drafting and before I start doing a self-edit. Sometimes because of scheduling, contracts, that sort of thing, I just don't have time to do that. But I really prefer to do it because I like having a little bit of distance from the project. I find that that distance makes it easier for me to notice errors and things to fix that I might not have noticed if I was just coming off of writing it. So I try and do that, but again, I don't always get to do that. So that's kind of the first step. I try and take that break. Then, of course, once again, I have to go to my schedule. So I break self-editing into 2 phases. Really, actually 3 phases. So the first phase is I reread over the project. The second phase is I plan edits. And then the third phase is I actually do the edits. And so that's how I do basically kind of all edits, to be honest, but that's how I get going with the self-edit. And so I reread over the whole project and I make notes as I read. So when I read, I'm actually doing 2 things. I'm making notes on what I think needs to be fixed, needs to be better, improved, what have you, or things that I think are maybe missing that should be put in, whatever I think needs to kind of be better about the story. And this is from every kind of aspect. This includes things like character, pacing, plot, world building, anything in that chapter that I think needs to be improved, I make note of all at once. I'm not the sort of person who does one reading for character, one reading for world building. I don't do that. I am quite honestly too lazy to do that. I just like to do it all in one go. And then what I will also do when I'm doing that is I go into Plotter and I update the chapter summary. So I have summaries of each chapter in Plotter, and what I go through when I read is I check that chapter summary and I make sure that everything in there is matching what I wrote in the chapter. This way, when I go to plan revisions, I have an updated chapter summary and I know what's in every chapter. So if I've forgotten something, I can look at the chapter summary and I don't have to like go back and reread the book again. So that's what I do. I also, in Plotter, I will make note of the place that the chapter is happening in and all the characters who are in that chapter. And I do this because when I'm going to do revisions, for example, if I decide, hey, this character's arc is not very good, or it needs to be increased and I need to have them in more chapters, in Plotter, I can then filter for every chapter that that character is in, and I can look at them all and I can see places where I want to make adjustments. I could see chapters where I can add them in and like therefore add more to their arc. And so that's why I do that, because it makes it again easier for me to plan the revisions. And so that's what I do when I am rereading over the story. I am updating those summaries and making my notes and tagging the characters and tagging the places. And so once I am done reading through, I have all of my notes, and at that point I start organizing my notes that I've taken. So all those revisions notes I took for each chapter, I start kind of picking out things that are maybe more overarching, because sometimes a note is something very specifically for a chapter, and sometimes it's kind of like the character is really weak in here and that's just being repeated, in which case I just know, okay, overall I need to improve this character's arc. And so if there are any big kind of overarching things, I will pull those out of the chapter by chapter notes and I will make those more overall notes for revision. And so I do that organization of the notes. And once I have that, I go back into Plotter and I make a revision layer. And in that revision layer is where I'm going to put all my revision notes. So all the notes that are specific to a chapter, I go in and I will add those in bullet pointed under the revision notes. And I do that all first so that everything that is very specific to a chapter is all noted for revision right from the beginning. And from there, then I have to plan edits for those things that are more overarching. So things like, okay, if a character arc needs to be edited, and because of the way that I plot in Plotter, I have that character arc separately plotted. And so at that point, I kind of want to look over that. Oh, also, I forgot to mention when I'm reading through the book, I'm also making note in Plotter of things that I missed doing. So that, what I talked about before when I'm drafting, sometimes something just doesn't work or doesn't feel good. I'm looking through Plotter and seeing what I missed in there and kind of like taking that so that I know, okay, this is the stuff that I didn't do. So that when I go and do that revision process, I can also make note of those things that didn't get touched on and like where I want to put those, how those want to be organized, that sort of thing. So there's an organization in the planning process of the things that I missed and like where those can be put in. But again, going back to those overarching notes, like I said, if it's something about a character arc, I can go to their character arc layer and I can move things around, I can change plans, and that's kind of how I go about planning those edits. And usually when I'm in that planning phase, this is something that I also block out on my calendar. I try and kind of block it out and do kind of a daily to-do list based on whatever I'm working on. So if I know that I have to fix the arcs of 2 characters, I might assign one day I work on this character arc, the next day I work on this character arc, etc., etc. And I usually try and give about a week to 2 weeks for planning edits, and like a week for the actual rereading of the book. I always try and do that in a week just so that I'm not spending so much time on it. And then again, yes, give myself a week or 2 weeks to plan all those edits. And again, that sort of feeling of like knowing what is like wrong with a book or what needs to be fixed with a book, to me that's just kind of just you as an author kind of feeling out your story and feeling what you think is working or not working. I don't really know that there's a way for me to say what that is necessarily, but I can say the things you can look at are characters, and like if characters are coming across rounded or flat, pacing, if the book feels too slow in places or too fast in places, setting, if you are getting a good idea of the setting in all books, and whether that feels like it's being put together well. And then world building, if the world that you've built, the magic systems, those sorts of things, if those make sense or those are consistent. I would say those are usually the things that I am looking at. And so those are things that you can think about in that self-editing process when you're making notes on rereading the book, or making notes on like planning edits and like what you're going to put together. So that's what I would say is what goes into my planning. And then from there, I'm actually going ahead and executing the edits. And usually the way I do this is I work on 3 chapters a day, maybe 4 chapters a day is usually what I will set out for edits. And so that's kind of how I schedule that into that daily to-do list. But sometimes I will need to add whole new chapters. So I'll need to draft a whole new chapter. In that case, I will set that aside as something that I use the whole day for. So I won't edit work and then also write a chapter. I really try to avoid doing that. I will usually set aside a whole day just to work on writing that chapter. And then the next day before I edit the other chapters, I will like include an edit of that chapter in which I'm just kind of like reading over it to make sure everything makes sense and I'm getting everything in, because that chapter is basically at a first draft stage and I need to make sure that it is like more polished, because when I finish going through all those chapters, they're all going to be polished. And so I want that for every single chapter. So if I have to draft a new chapter, I also need to set aside some time to go through and edit that as well. And so that is basically that self-editing process. And I do that until I am finished going through the whole book. That process, the amount of time it takes kind of varies. I usually try to set aside like a month and a half for that. Usually I expect it to take a month, but sometimes if a book I'm working on is longer, it's probably more likely to take kind of like a month and a half to 2 months. And so I really rely on doing that to-do list in Notion to kind of give me a general idea of how much time I'm going to need. And then I kind of plan out from there, chunking into the 2-year calendar and then chunking into the Google Calendar. So it's a bit of a reverse in that way, in which case I kind of set aside how much time I'm going to need on the to-do list, and I use that to help inform how much time I'm going to need to chunk out for everything. Here I am for that second missing clip, which is about getting feedback. So this is the process that I move on to after doing my self-edit. In that case, I have a clean draft that I then send off to. The way I like to do this, and usually try to do this, is to send to my beta readers first, and then do another draft based on their feedback, and then send to my agent after to have her read. So during that beta reader process, essentially what I will do is I will create a Google form. And so this Google form exists so that I can ask my beta readers targeted questions about what they're reading, and have them fill that out. I put this all together based on a video that I will also link, which is from Lindsay Puckett about creating a beta reader form. I really like doing this because it helps focus what beta readers are commenting on, and gives kind of gives them something to specifically answer questions about, as opposed to just being like, just send me notes about anything. Then I can get kind of targeted notes about the things I actually care about when it comes to character, setting, twists, etc. And so that's what I do. I put together that form, and then I send the manuscript off to the beta readers, and I usually ask for them to get back to me in a month, just because I find that that's like a good amount of time to read. It's a good amount of a break for me to kind of get back to it. And so that's the timeline I set for that. The beta readers I have are people that I've been friends with for years now. At the beginning of my kind of author journey, the way I used to get beta readers is I would kind of just put an open call on Twitter and say, this is my book, is anyone interested in beta reading? And I did get some great beta readers that way, but I also got some not so great beta readers that way. So however you kind of can go about it. There are lots of different ways to kind of go about soliciting those readers, but the ones that I use now are, again, people that I've been friends with for years, who I trust to give me, critical feedback that is also like, legitimately like kind. Like, I think in the past I've gotten some very like kind of like unnecessarily snarky feedback, in which it's kind of like, okay, what's kind of the point of this? And what I want is like critical, targeted feedback that is giving me things to work on, but not, being really shitty about it, for lack of a better way to describe it. And so that's the way I do that process. And then when I send that edited manuscript to my agent, the difference is that I don't give my agent any sort of timeline, and I don't give my agent any sort of like form to fill out. And the way that I tackle beta reader feedback, which is very similar to how I tackle my agent feedback, but the way I do the beta reader feedback is I go through that form and all the results, and I kind of write down bullet points, everything that was kind of commented on, and then I kind of pull out the overarching kind of things that are larger that need to be fixed and separate them out from things that are kind of more specific or targeted that I think would just have to be mentioned in one chapter or another. And then I go back to Plotter and I make that revision kind of section again. And then where I would put things like per chapter, I'll put in that revision layer. And the bigger changes I kind of go through and I'll change in the other layers. And then similarly to how I do the self-edit, I create basically a schedule for myself of like when I'm gonna work on things, and then I basically execute it. The only difference between me doing that for my agent is my agent will sometimes make inline notes on the Microsoft Word actual document. And so I just have to go and like take all of those comments and pull them into Scrivener, so that I can address them all there, because I do all of my developmental edits in Scrivener. I only stay in Microsoft Word once we get to the line level edit part of it, because once we're at that portion, it's a lot of like agreeing or like accepting certain changes, and it's just easier to do it in Microsoft Word than it is to try and port it back to Scrivener just so I can export it to Microsoft Word anyway. And so that's kind of the process, and like the time it takes me to do the beta reader edit usually is a month to 1 month. 1 month to like 1.5 months, pretty similar to what it would take me to do that self edit, though I would say tends to be a little bit not as long because I've done so many edits in that self edit process. And when it gets to my agent, we will do several rounds of edits together, because at that point we are polishing the book for submission, and so we are trying to get it into the best possible shape. And so we'll go back and forth, usually 3 to 4 rounds, sometimes more if it requires it. And the back and forth that we do tends to last about 3 to 6 months. That's how long it takes us. And I'll also say as an additional note, that when I schedule myself to work on these edits and I get like an edit letter or feedback from beta readers, the very first day, all I do is just read the feedback. I don't try and do the edits that day because sometimes like getting a feedback can be like emotional, at least it is for me, and so I like to give myself a day. But again, once I'm past that process and me and my agent are in that final sort of back and forth section, that's when we kind of like, when we reach that final point where she's like, okay, yeah, we're ready to go on submission, that's when I consider that process, at least for that point, to be finished. And that back and forth feedback process is exactly the same with editorial feedback with a publisher. I get usually an editorial letter and the Word document with some inline comments. I do the exact same thing. That is just how I handle all feedback, is I do bullet point notes. I pick out the overarching things that need larger planning. I go into Plotter, I make those changes there. I come out with a new Plotter outline. I do the edits, doing 3 to 4 chapters every day until I've reached the end and I've finished. And that is how I handle every single edit. And that is how I get to that complete book sort of finish part. And yeah, that is the end of the novel writing process. But I am going to talk about some additional things, because the process is not always that smooth or linear. The first additional topic I'm going to talk about is research and inspiration. So because I always set my books in a real world place, often I will want to go to that place and do a little bit more additional research to add on to like kind of the full flavor of the book. And so what I will often do is I will draft the whole book just with the knowledge I have and what I could get online, blah, blah, blah. And then usually at some point later in the process, I will try and actually go to the place, and at that point that kind of becomes baked into my revision process. So whatever additional information I learn or things that I pick up on, pictures, video, whatever inspiration I get from that research phase, I will usually fold into my revision process, and I will just add that onto the revision process, and then I can add it in that way and as part of that. And so that is not really so linear, because usually I am researching things and learning things throughout the whole process of the book. Sometimes there are things that I'm changing in like the final, bit of time before submission. There are things where in the publication process I'm changing right before we're about to do our final edit. This process is like ongoing and not linear. And in this second bit, I just want to talk a little bit about when things do not go as expected, because this is a very neat and, like I said, linear representation of my writing and creative process, but sometimes things don't go that smoothly. And this comes back to when I was talking about like picking the right idea. Sometimes I am in the part of the process and that idea that felt so right at that moment doesn't feel like that later. For example, I might decide that a project just isn't working before it even gets to beta readers or before it gets to my agent. Sometimes I start working on something with my agent and I realize that that isn't working and I drop off there. If you want to hear a full summary of all the times I've kind of shelved a project, you can check out my video talking about revisiting my failures, which is a very dramatic title for a video that is really just about the times that I've shelved books. And that video will make it very clear to you that this is really not a linear process. Sometimes a book doesn't work out and it doesn't go all the way to completion. Sometimes that happens in an earlier phase, sometimes in a later phase. And so this is not always the case in which I pick an idea and I write it and I go step to step to step and finish novel submission. Everything is good. That does not always happen. And so I just want to make aware that that is also part of that creative process. And that is it for this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And if you have any more questions about this process, please let me know. Please comment and share that all with me. I just wanted to be able to provide like a big, nice overview with additional resources, just based on requests I've gotten in the past for people really wanting to know, like, what is my full writing process top to bottom. And this, I feel like, really encompasses it very well, along with those videos where I've done kind of much lengthier, deeper dives as well. So I hope that is helpful for those of you that really wanted to know that. And yeah, that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.